Today, after 8 years of waiting, we're finally going to be asking that question again. Can two cheap graphics cards give you enough gaming power to get by, and save you money over buying just the one? Right, so today's video is going to be a little bit of a weird one because, as you can see over here, I was trying to do SLI work with GTX 480s, and that went as bad as possible. The idea is today we're still going to do something dual GPU wise, but until I get a motherboard that supports SLI, how cheap can you still do Crossfire? Because I've got this one weird R7 350 that was next to nothing when I bought this. I think this was £3-4, and then I've also got this R7 350 that we rescued and bought for about £2. So in total this is around £5 worth of graphics cards. For years there was always this idea that maybe instead of upgrading your graphics card, you just run two of them. So we're going to find out, can you still do that with the lowest amount you could possibly want to spend? Now this entire mess we can finish another day. This was an attempt at SLIing GTX 480s, and don't worry, I'm still going to do it. It just turns out that there's no way of bodging them to work on modern motherboards anymore. You need an actual supported motherboard, which we don't have. But the thing is, Crossfire doesn't have that problem. Crossfire really doesn't have that problem. You don't even need a cable. So as much as a nightmare it's been trying to do the way Nvidia wants you to do things, the way AMD works means that this should be entirely a viable idea. So let's get this card out, take out the second one, and let's try and do this the cheap way. So we've got one R7 350, and then we've got our second R7 350, which we can whack just beneath it here. Now we should need display out of these, which we can do over DVI, and let's just turn this on real quick and see what this does. It's a bit of an interesting question though, isn't it? Because these graphics cards are worthless. Most GCN cards are worthless. Despite being a different architecture, could we whack in a third card? Because this was also only £2. Maybe that'll be a follow-up if this goes well, who knows. We'll try and do three-way SLI for under a tenner. We'll go straight for modded drivers because those have got the best chance of working. And let's just double check in Device Manager. Do we have, yep, so we've got two graphics cards there. We want the 2050 kernel, which is the latest one it supports. We want to go for Microsoft installer because we're doing SLI. And I think we might have to do a couple of extra bits in here to make sure it's all enabled and working. So far this is going much easier than the 480s. I mean, look at this mess of cables I needed for the Nvidia side of things. No, you don't need that for AMD. AMD just says plug it in. if this actually just works, this is going to be... Oh. They're flashing. Is that working? Oh, it's installed the other one. I swear, if this just works, this might actually not be a terrible idea. I mean, of course it's going to be a terrible idea, but it might be less terrible than what I was originally planning on doing. Oh, there was lots of things flashing up. Okay, multi-adapter. This is where we get a little bit complicated. Now, it has recognised both of these as R7 350s. You can see R7 350, R7 350. Now, I've got nothing against Nvidia cards, but I need to literally build another computer to do this with an Nvidia card. I can't get it to work any other way. All the old software that used to work to force it doesn't seem to work anymore, and it was just becoming a complete mess that's been going on for weeks with different cables, different power supplies, different drivers. I mean, this just seems to be working straight out of the gates. I literally just found this one in the shed and that one was in the drawer. Now we should just need to restart. Once again, if this does work, I'm going to be amazed. Right, if we launch the AMD drivers now, once again, it goes to show that AMD might be good at something. Where's GPU 2? It knows there's... GPU 2 is here. Right, where do we configure Crossfire? Where do you change these things? It's been so long. Where's my Crossfire options? AMD Crossfire. Enable. Am I sure I want to enable AMD Crossfire? Yes. Is it gonna work? Did it do it? Did it work? This is actually a little bit exciting how smoothly this is... No, it's crashed again. We are enabled for Crossfire. Show Crossfire logo. Yes. Does Crossfire have any options anymore? So when we look over here, what we've got is we've got GPU 1, GPU 2. The first one is provided by Dell. The second one is MSI. So we've got an MSI one and then a Dell one. Let's launch MSI Afterburner though and see if they're actually running together in tandem. Oh, no, GPU 2 kicked in there for a second. We'll restart the PC. The graphics card is getting warmer. Do we have a game we can test real quick on the desktop that's apparently Crossfire supported? I have no idea. What about Crysis? Ah, this is it. Okay, we have to enable it on a optimized 1x1 AFR compatible. So if we list it as AFR compatible and then we launch Crysis, will this work? It's there. We have the Crossfire logo. Graphics 720p. It's set to the highest settings. This could be a terrible idea. No, it's it's running great. Both graphics cards locked 50 FPS in Crysis. Ultra settings. Is this a good idea? This looks amazing. The frame pacing's perfect. £5 Crossfire works. Oh, this is way better than Nvidia's options. Nvidia doesn't let you do this. AMD says, yeah, go for it. This is just an option they let you set up. We're going to have to set things up game by game to check what works best, but it's capped our frame rate at 50 FPS, but I'm not complaining, which you do not expect from Crossfire at all. We're set up and working. Crossfire's all enabled. On with the rest of the video. Now, to try and put some of this into perspective, I did go through and run the card through 3D Mark. It was a little bit difficult to try and get them to understand Time Spy and dedicated multi-GPU and that modern side of things, so I went with the old school 3D Mark Firestrike test. And in this test we went and we actually managed to get some alright results that showed the performance of the card. So in terms of our £5 Crossfire setup, it quite comfortably beats AMD's previous flagship, the 5850, it beats a 750 Ti, it beats a GCN-based R9 255, and becomes quite comparable to a GTX 1630, which is by no means a great graphics card, but it is at least a modern one, and it also matches AMD's HD 5970 X2. Well, it's not actually an X2 card, but it is two cards in one, so even then we are eking out more performance than their terascale flagship. It actually performs in real world a bit like a GTX 480, which is why I've included that result in there, but in the actual benchmarks, when everything is being utilised properly, it quite comfortably beats it still. Now, it's also worth remembering that these are a really ideal use case scenario with nearly perfect scaling, but it goes to show that already straight off the bat, this £5 Crossfire setup, well, it's beating some of the older Nvidia and AMD flagships, even some of the ones that were the most powerful cards of their release year. But the thing is, with a video like this, there's no point me boring you on the history of Crossfire or anything like that, because really that is what would require a bigger and more important video covering this topic properly, not grabbing two random graphics cards, forcing them into a system and then somehow praying it works, which is the situation we've ended up with today. Either way, I've gone through game by game and configured them all for their best mode of Crossfire, sometimes taking me upwards of an hour to actually get a benchmark done to try and get the game running optimally, because even though this setup seems to be working fine, Crossfire, and by extension SLI, definitely have their problems, especially in 2025. So with that all out of the way, why don't we see how this works by taking two cheap graphics cards totaling £5 and seeing how they perform when they're paired together in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have Grand Theft Auto 5 with the Legacy version. Now, the reason we are testing the Legacy version is because it's running on DirectX 11, and generally you need DirectX 9, 10 or 11 for Crossfire to work. Now, there are implementations for DirectX 12 which don't really seem to work very well, and it's very game dependent as when it becomes multi-GPU, and we'll be talking about that later. But in terms of actually what we're seeing in front of us right now, we're seeing GTA 5 running with very high settings in 1080p, seeing 30 FPS locked on average. Now, it could stray slightly away from this figure, but generally you are looking at a pretty consistent frame rate, provided you were aiming for a 30 FPS target. And this was with a decent chunk of settings turned on, including AMD's CHS shadows. So the game actually looked pretty decent while it was there running. The thing is though, some of you are going to be questioning, if we can run the game with very high settings like this, well, why aren't we aiming for 60 FPS with lower settings? Well, I did go out of my way to try, and it seems like the settings themselves made very little difference to the actual frame rate consistency. What you could do was turn the resolution down to 720p, and when I first launched in-game, well, things seemed absolutely fine. We were seeing a perfectly locked 60 FPS with the same high settings. But unfortunately, no matter how much you tweak these around, you could go down to the very lowest of settings, and unfortunately, just with the way Crossfire is utilised, it would go a little bit wrong, and you'd see the game hover with a very stuttery frame rate in the mid-30s, and then return back to its locked 60 FPS. So the best way to play this game is definitely 1080p with very high settings and a capped frame rate, but you can aim for 60 FPS if you want. It's just not going to stay that way for very long. And to put into perspective why DirectX 12 is a little bit of a problem, well, when it came out I remember all of this fuss about it, and we will have to cover this more in depth at some point, because AMD was advertising two RX 480s could match or surpass a GTX 1080 Ti and all that kind of nonsense. But in reality, most games never actually took on support for it, as it was no longer up to the developers of the graphics cards to produce drivers that would work for it, it was now up to the developers of the game. And for such a small market, well, there was no need. What you can do though is, in a lot of modern titles, utilise one graphics card for running the game, and then another graphics card for frame generation, and also scaling the game. So we were able to run the game in low settings in 720p, with FSR and frame generation being run on the other card. And the experience is about as good as it looks. When you're actually just on the predetermined benchmark route, it doesn't look too bad. But trying to control the game like this, well, I've dabbled with frame generation before, and splitting it across two cards does seem to add a decent degree of latency to when your actual inputs will go on screen. So Cyberpunk 2077, well, even dual GPUs aren't going to save things here. When it came to BeamNG, we were eventually able to get the Crossfire settings working in a way that wasn't causing too much flickering. In fact, I'm fairly sure we got rid of all of the flickering here, it just took a while. But we did have to run the game with lower textures and the rest of the game's options set to high. But what this did mean was we had a rather decent looking game, even if we were capped to just the 720p resolution. Unfortunately, no matter how much tweaking I did, I couldn't get the frame rate completely smooth. So although we have an average of 30 FPS, you can see those frame times in the top left, and you did notice the stutter here. This was always an issue with Crossfire setups, but then again, BeamNG was likely never an intended use case here, but we did eventually get it running somewhat okay. But the thing is, the Source engine was always one of those engines that just was so well used and so well supported that dual GPU setups, whether it's from Nvidia or whether it's from AMD, they always just tended to work well. But how is it when you take the latest and probably the most intensive Source game there is out there and throw it up against a setup like this? Well, with high and ultra settings, we were actually able to get both graphics cards rendering the game without too many problems. The only problem there was is that the game will only render properly when you're using a 4:3 resolution, so we had to opt for 1600 by 1200 to make the game actually playable. Now, it did look pretty good with high and ultra settings, and I'm fairly sure there was some odd scaling going on with the HUD that could become a little bit flickery in times, and do not open the menu. That would be best described as seizure-inducing, but Black Mesa here did actually run. It just could have ran a little bit better if it was actually supported. To give you an idea of how well things scale in older Source games though, utilising Half-Life 2, even the latest version with all the updates from Valve, well, it still works perfectly fine here. Ultra settings in 1080p, and it was very rare we saw a single stutter or a single frame drop. So there was this little golden era for these cards when they were well supported, because even though these are two relatively okay graphics cards by themselves, what you end up with is something that can really handle these older supported games through Crossfire without a single hitch or frame drop. Now, both of these cards can probably manage Half-Life 2 by themselves, but maybe it wouldn't be quite as smooth as we've managed to get things here. Given that I always seem to refer to Mount & Blade Bannerlord as the pinnacle of optimization, well, it does seem that one thing has gone neglected, which is Crossfire, but that's actually nothing to do with the developers, that is down to AMD. And who can really blame them? I'm fairly sure this game is entirely unsupported on their drivers. It took a little bit of time to actually get the game launching, and even then, to get the flickering down to this level we've got it here, took even longer. But we were able to run the game with high settings in 720p. Now, you could reduce a few of these down to medium, but it wouldn't necessarily improve your frame rate all too much, because really the game has no idea what's actually going on. I'm not going to say this is playable, because let's be honest, it really isn't playable, but it was interesting to see that we did get at least some form of GPU scaling working here. Now, I didn't necessarily think that the original Warband game would have support for this, but turns out it works perfectly fine. So to try and make it at least a little bit challenging, I did load up the latest DLC, which was Vikings Conquest, which tried to bring a few prettier aspects to the Mount & Blade engine. I quite like how this game looks, and I always do in its native form anyway, but let's be honest, it is not it's not the most prettiest game at times. But here, with ultra settings, I didn't think it looked too bad, and we did see the game run at 60 FPS, and this was all in a 1080p resolution. So for Mount & Blade Warband, once again one of those mid-2000s to early 2010s games that seems to have weirdly good scaling with Crossfire, it was a really good experience. When you talk about that golden era of Crossfire and SLI gaming, it mostly comes from sort of about 2007 to about 2015, and it really goes to show here with Skyrim Anniversary, where you are just going to be running the game with high settings in 1080p and seeing anywhere from the mid-20s up to 35 FPS. Drop things down to medium and things do get a little bit better. You're never going to get perfect frame pacing, but then again this is a Bethesda title, and it was nice to see the cards actually scale somewhat okay without any flickering problems. In a similar vein to Skyrim, you have the original Tomb Raider remake here, and with high and very high settings in 1080p, well, you're seeing a completely locked 60 FPS with perfect utilization, no flickering, no shimmering, no problems. I mean, this really is a golden example of how Crossfire should work, and I'm fairly sure this is one of those games that was on all of AMD's benchmark for all of those most powerful cards they could release, you know, the HD 4870X2, the 5970, which was 2 cards in one, and the same on the Nvidia side as well for those SLI cards. This game really does scale well with them, and it's nice to see, even on our scuffed setup, well, it's still just about hanging in there. Now, there was no reason to test this one beyond my own initial curiosity of would RimWorld run with Crossfire, and it turns out that yeah, it runs. I'm fairly sure there was some odd things happening with the sprites at times, but in terms of the actual graphical side load, well, you were seeing pretty much bang on 60 FPS at all times. The only time the frame rate dropped is when you accelerated the game and slowed down the tick rate, and that is nothing to do with the graphics card here. So RimWorld, miraculously and very strangely, does actually support Crossfire quite well. There's no reason to be doing this as it runs fine on a single card, but at least you get that little logo in the top right saying this is a Crossfire certified game. That, and it was pretty fun to test. But can it run Crysis? Well, given that was what we originally tested to make sure Crossfire was working, it should go as no surprise that yes, Crysis is really well supported by Crossfire and the likes. But to see how far we could actually push things, we were using ultra settings with DirectX 10 in the 1080p resolution, and we saw around 50 FPS on average, which would hover around the mid-40s when you were in heavy combat. Generally, when you were just outside and not much was happening, you'd see well over 60 FPS if you left it uncapped, but for terms of actual frame rate stability, keeping it capped was definitely the better option. So, I mean, for Crysis and these classic titles, well, it's actually not a bad solution. It's just, the moment something goes wrong, you're gonna have to spend an hour per game trying to get it to run as good as this is out of the box. So there we have it, the benchmarks. And how would I describe the performance overall given how botched this actual setup is? Well, the good news is, when a game scaled well, it was actually really smooth and was far better than I was actually ever expecting it to be. So essentially you got free performance from just having 2 worthless cards lying around. and there really was a golden era for games that ran in Crossfire. I mean, anything from sort of 2007 up to about 2015, 2016 seems to work absolutely fine out of the box. I mean, we ran into no problems with Skyrim, Half-Life 2, anything along that sort of era, especially Tomb Raider, we saw exceptional performance from that you wouldn't expect from a graphics card like this, especially not a setup as janky as this. Where things do get a little bit questionable though, is with new games, because when it comes to running DirectX 12 or Vulkan, well, you need explicit multi-GPU support enabled, which was meant to be the next big thing. And in my experience testing today, I couldn't get it to work anywhere. I mean, yes, we did see that you can use one for frame gen, and that was a fun idea, using a second graphics card to generate fake frames, and you actually got a pretty smooth experience, at least in terms of the visuals. It's just a shame that the latency of having another graphics card do it means that the game is nigh on uncontrollable. I mean, I've done frame generation before with a GTX 480 in Red Dead Redemption 2, and we locked the game at 15 FPS, doubled it up to 30, and it was still somewhat playable. But in a similar situation here with similar frames, it's just not the case because of the latency of using another graphics card. And then of course, I mean, some people are going to take this as either a pro or a con because it is quite fun tweaking around with Crossfire and seeing if you can make it work. But sometimes you'll be spending up to an hour just to try and make a game launch properly on this kind of setup, which is actually a setup that AMD says is fine to use. I mean, at the end of the day, it's fun to configure it, but towards the end, it was getting quite grating to try and get away from the flickering or try and make games stable. So there we have it. I did not think after I did this last time 8 years ago, was it 8 years ago now with cheap Crossfire, I didn't think we'd be doing it again. And it turns out that yes, it does actually have somewhat of a purpose, because in some games you can actually get a nice performance increase out of using two cheap graphics cards. I don't know, I have no idea how practical this solution is, because I remember back when the RX 480 came out, that AMD said you could match flagship performance by using two of them together. And I'm sure in certain titles, I mean, Ashes of the Singularity, a game that I've never heard anyone once talk about playing, I've only ever heard about it as a benchmark, you'd get perfect scaling. But in my experience, I actually don't know how dead multi-GPU is. We're going to have to investigate this properly at some point. But either way, I think the main takeaway from this shouldn't be on actual value, because there's really no reason to be doing this at all, unless you want to do something stupid, which is the main reason to do this. Because, I mean, if you want to build a retro system, you can get two of these cheap GCN cards, have an excellent Crossfire experience in that golden era of Crossfire games, and it's going to cost you nothing to do so. And it'll probably be cheaper than buying an old flagship that may or may not work, because these cards are just unkillable. So don't worry, I will still be trying to do GTX 480 SLI, that video's not gone out the window. I just have to build a decent setup that'll handle it, and I'm already working on something. So thank you all very much for watching, and good night.